You're listening to the Nature's Image Farm podcast. I'm your host, Greg Burns, and we're talking bees, homesteading, and the old-time ways. This episode is brought to you by EnduraHive wax-dipped equipment. The days of painting bee boxes are over. Our unique wax-dip process expels water from the wood, replaces and impregnates it with our proprietary blend of microcrystalline wax, offering superior weather protection inside and out, without the mess or expense of paint. No paint, no rot, no hassle. EnduraHive, built to endure. For more information, check them out at naturesimagefarm.com. Now, on to the show. Well, hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. I am so excited to bring to you the long-lost Fred Dunn episode. Man, what a story that was. About 2 years ago, Jake and I traveled clear up to the Keystone State of Pennsylvania, traversing snow and ice to go visit with the one and only Fred Dunn. Now, I know you know who Fred Dunn is. If you don't, Fred has a fantastic YouTube channel, also a podcast, The Way to Bee, and he has become really a pillar for so many in the beekeeping industry, especially those folks just getting started. Fred is a one-of-a-kind guy, and it was an absolute honor to sit down with him to talk bees. What I love about Fred is he has a certain way of relaying his experience. And it's so unique and it's so refreshing. He's so candid and honest and has an incredible sense of humor. He's so much fun to be around, so much fun to talk bees with. This episode got lost on our hard drives. It started off as a video episode. You may have seen the video on our YouTube channel, interview with Fred Dunn, and it was more of a sarcastic parody of the mighty short-tail shrew. Well, the audio of that version, we had some troubles with hard drives, troubles with the memory cards, and we pretty much lost all the footage. We were able to recover it, and then every time I would go to get this podcast ready, something would happen. It just seemed like every time I went to go post or work on this episode, it just wasn't meant to be. Fast forward to just a couple days ago, and it's on the forefront of my mind again. And sure enough, I'm able to find the audio, get it plugged in, get everything fixed up. And timing is everything. And I think a lot of us beekeepers find ourselves in a current situation where we sometimes feel like we're chasing our tail to do right by the bees. There is an enormous amount of back and forth and an enormous amount of animosity between certain tribes of beekeeping, if you will, especially when it comes to those that treat and those that don't. And so the timing is absolutely impeccable with this conversation from a couple years ago with Fred Dunn. So if you've got tender toes, I'll give you a warning. Go ahead and lace up those steel toes. I'm so excited to bring you the long-lost, treatment-free episode with Fred Dunn. Let's get right to it.
Talking bees in general is informative to people. The more they hear from people from different parts of the country and how they approach beekeeping and on different levels, it's all valuable. So commercial beekeepers do one thing one way and find something that works economically for them. Backyard beekeepers, which is my target group of people, often have a disproportionate investment in their bees. Much like they look at them almost as pets, which can backfire because then they're also emotionally connected and attached to their bees. And if they lose a colony, it's a big deal. But they have the opportunity to do more configuration-wise, equipment-wise. Like you're not going to see a commercial beekeeper with a bunch of slatted racks, high visors, insulated inner covers if it's not necessary for where they live and things like that, because it's an additional expense that, as a lot of commercial beekeepers will say, does not have a return that justifies that expense, the more equipment that you're dealing with. So for my beekeeping, but the constant is biology. So bee biology, bee behavior, how bees harvest and use resources, how they finish off the interior of their boxes, things like that. Those are across the board for every beekeeper on whatever level. So if we understand the biology of the bees, nutritional requirements of the bees, and then of course that annual rhythm of the bees for reproduction and everything else, then you can apply that and it's scalable no matter what you're trying to do with your bees. So that's what I focus on.
A lot of folks who are watching your channel or checking out your videos know not only the quality of the videos, there's a certain look that you have with your videos, but you also have a certain way of presenting information in a way that is non-confrontational. It's a way where you are sharing the information, you're doing your research and then presenting that. And I think that's a great way to do it, because folks then can take it or leave it. And you're not saying, if you don't subscribe to these set of ideas, then you're not a beekeeper, or you're doing it wrong, or you're doing it right. A lot of folks, if your target market is backyard beekeepers, or even as they grow up, if they grow into sideline, anything else, creating the fundamental basics, like you mentioned there, is kind of a big deal. And a lot of folks, when they first get started, it's incredibly easy to get completely lost in the weeds, to where you're thinking, well, I have to have this particular box, I have to have this strain of bee, I have to do all these things right, or I'm going to fail. They're looking for the how-to instead of the why. And I think what you do is you create a foundation to where here's what bees do, here's why they do what they do, here is the equipment that we're using, and you let folks kind of see that. Especially in your last videos, we were going through and you're clearing off snow and you're using the snow visors, you're using your tool to clear off. Those are things that large sideliners and commercial guys never deal with, because their bees are somewhere warm in those kind of time periods.
Well, right. And if you're a commercial beekeeper, you're going to cut your losses by migrating your hives. Right. Even the big beekeepers in the state of Pennsylvania here, like Hackenberg, people that everyone's heard of, right, they have wintering grounds that they haul their bees to. Right. So you're right, they don't encounter that. And but the idea, and again, clearing, it's manpower intensive. So if you had 1,000 hives or 500 hives, you'd be out in that snow all day long and would not accomplish it all, only to have them backfill again. It's also why I mentioned, while I'm clearing off those entrances, what direction the landing board's facing. Right. Because there are these discussions too about what direction your landing board should face, and does that make a difference? Well, if you're in a heavy snowfall area, it can and it does. And the endless discussions about insulating, not insulating, those go on and on forever, but it ties in with what you just said. Somebody that's starting out with beekeeping likes to approach it the way they would almost anything else, because bees are unique in that none of us, I'm a master beekeeper. You would assume that if that's my title, I know everything about bees. That's the master beekeeper. Right. Okay, but really master beekeepers are educators. And you're also educating yourself continuously about the biology of the bees and, of course, maintaining bees. But the people that are starting out brand new, they want to get their list. What's the best hive? So most people, it's the Consumer Reports approach. I want to see all the hives available, and I want to see which one performs the best. That answer doesn't exist, because it ties into, what do you want out of beekeeping? What are your physical limitations, potentially, if any? What kind of bees are you going to keep? And what do you expect from those bees in that hive? So all of these things come into play. And you talk about a polarizing discussion, bring up flow hive, and you'll see people disappear. You'll see people cross their arms. You'll see it. And this tolerance that you're talking about, that you mentioned in the beginning, doesn't exist in a lot of beekeeping groups. We are exclusively top bar beekeepers. We are exclusively horizontal beekeepers. We are exclusively Langstroth hive beekeepers. When you do that, you shut yourself off from a lot of learning about bee biology, where later you figure out configurations that would work for somebody who's handicapped, a configuration that works for somebody who's elderly that can no longer lift boxes. Instead of just saying, well, you can't be a beekeeper anymore, there may be options like horizontal hives. So on my channel, it's my goal not to cover every beehive manufacturer, but beehive configurations generally. That's why we have the Langstroth hives, we have the flow hives, and we have the long Langstroth horizontal hive, and then we have the Layens hive, which is so unique, it almost doesn't play well with any of the others. And then, of course, the top bar hives, which are just a top bar. And so the thing is, then you can see in the same location, under the same conditions, with the same annual rhythm, exactly how each of these configurations performs well or doesn't. And if it doesn't, what does it mean not to perform well? The baseline is, are your bees alive when you hit spring? We're sitting here at this table right now with several feet of snow outside that window. Right. So for some people who are from the South, it's unimaginable that you have bees that are surviving in boxes that are uninsulated. So that's the first thing that people think. And the problem is, again, it's transference of a human experience to a bee that's an insect that behaves collectively like a warm-blooded animal. So as a superorganism, they generate their own heat. Individually, bees can't survive. That's why they're eusocial. But they can manage to survive in a lot of different, what we consider hostile environments. And you have to stop looking at them from the perspective of, if I were in that box, would I be comfortable? No, you'd be dead already.
So if your bees are cold, if you're cold, your bees are cold, you should bring them inside.
These are
things that are constantly out in the forefront. I think the smart people, they use the word, I think it's called anthropomorphizing. Mm-hmm. And it's a real issue with beginning beekeepers. It's a real issue with, and I'm speaking for myself here, it's a real issue with beginning farmers. It's a real issue with anyone who's first dipping their toes in to any kind of a learning opportunity coming from a 0 point of reference. And so we fall back on things that we think that we know or we feel or we understand. And that's led a lot of folks, including myself, down a very expensive, tragic school of hard knocks learning opportunity when we try to understand and we try to place value and circumstance on all these little things. You've got to be doing something right as far as understanding what it is that the bees are doing and how they fit into this circle of life, how they fit in your natural environment, or you wouldn't have so many hives that are continually to persist into the spring. When you were talking, where my mind was going was, so let's say you have, in looking at your last video, you've got probably minimal 6 different configurations. Of those 6, they get into different configurations kind of within their own class. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How long have you been creating such variety in your bee yard?
Oh, that's an interesting question, actually. Because I started off like a lot of people do. I went to probably Dayton at the time, and I just bought 8 full sets of beehives and then put them all out there. So they're all configured the same. The standard Langstroth, solid bottom board, deep. In fact, it came with 2 deeps and 2 mediums, standard inner cover, and then the telescoping outer cover. Nothing insulated, and an upper vent. And I had an upper entrance. Okay. And because that was general practice, and I didn't know enough to look at them to see if that was, you can fine tune it. Everybody has seen a Pinto go down the highway, and then you can see a Ferrari go down the highway. Yep. Okay, so this is the fine tuning of a beehive to make it perform like the Ferrari, because the bees can limp through into spring, or they can supercharge into spring. And so what you find is, for your environment, and this is huge, by the way, because humidity plays, annual rainfall plays, the temperatures that we're dealing with right now, all of those things play into how well your bees are going to get through. And then the strongest choice you have to make of all choices when it comes to getting bees is not who's selling nukes, who's selling packages, but you want regional, adapted bees that can handle your environment.
Let's talk about that.
And yeah, it's very important.
So there, a lot of folks who are listening, who are familiar with our channel, know. Any folks who are new to our channel don't know the history and the long, sad sob story. So we don't need to go down the full story. You can check out a prior podcast titled "Treatment Free and My Dead Bees."
Okay.
We went through an entire phase where somehow I was in the mindset that we could get bees to evolve in a point in time that me as a human exists, to where I could see changes and traits would start to express and things. Some things, sure. I can see more of the Caucasian and Carney line start to have a little bit different attitude, some different attributes, colors, cluster size. But those things seem to be inherent with characteristics that aren't evolving month by month or year by year or decade by decade. What do you mean when you say locally adapted bees, and how does a bee become locally adapted to anything and then prove out?
Okay,
forward?
this is both going to be the huge downside of the backyard beekeeper thinking they're going to come up with their own line of bees and adapt and survive, because I did that for 10 years.
Okay.
So the treatment-free method of beekeeping, which has come full circle now, but we need information to understand how that can work and where it can work, and how it may not work and where it may not work. If you are surrounded by a bunch of other beekeepers that are not on the same page and what beekeepers are, then you are not going to be able to live and let die and come up with the survivor line bees, which is what we used to call them, survivor stock. And then use those traits if they survive, given the varroa loading and everything else that we're talking about. You can't do it because you're constantly meddled with genetically by other bees in your area. This is why, for example, Dr. Leo Sherishkin takes huge heat, because he is Beekeeping with a Smile is the book that he helped edit and make available here in the United States. He has a very utopian view of beekeeping and wants you to look at your bees twice a year. A spring inspection, happy bees all summer, a fall inspection, and then the bees that make it, the bees that die, and the stock that you derive from that are those that don't die. Now, the problem is that people all over the country, if they all started, hey, I like that idea. I mean, who wouldn't? It sounds perfect. And you have to have a horizontal hive and has to be insulated with lamb's wool and everything else. But the thing of it is, he also has to admit, and does, that he owns 600 acres plus of land, a nature conservancy, and the competition for his bees genetically is not the same as it will be elsewhere. So what he will say is, this may not work for you. So darn tootin', it may not work for you, because where you are, you don't have the isolation that others have. Now here where I live, for example, I did that. I was on a hunt for survivor line bees because I wanted treatment free. Yeah. It's a perfect world. We want to keep the chemicals out if we could, right? Sure. And we also know the history of the varroa destructor mite, for example, that came and wiped out all these feral colonies in trees. But some survived. And those were the beginnings of those studies in the Arnott Forest for Cornell University. And Dr. Thomas Seeley did those studies. But there again, we had this mass die-off initially, and then we had those that survived and those that then swarmed out, of course, and then rehabitated all of these other cavities where the bees before that had died out now get reoccupied. Mm-hmm. But geographically, they're isolated again from competition from other bees, and therefore their genetics were allowed to adapt. And that's why his current thing is Darwinian beekeeping. Right. So, and this is something that a lot of in fact, there's treatment-free clubs. And if you treat your bees, you can't be a part of that club. Once again, it shuts out all of this discussion. We need these contrasting experiences so that we can work out why they work, why they fail. And so Now, just recently in a study that was just published, I take a little heat too, because when I bring in outside genetics, I get them from the bee weaver family in Texas. And they did exactly what I described. They're a multi-generational beekeeping company on a commercial scale, and they decided to not treat the bees and work only with the bees that survived. And they took a dramatic loss. But then they started to work only with those that survived, and those that carried high Varroa loads and things like that were out of their genetic pool. So they had to be willing to take massive losses to do that. Now, what's happened is recently they've done studies on the bee weaver line, which gets almost zero press in the academic community. They're not listed at Cornell, for example, among the most reputable Varroa tolerant or Varroa resistant or ankle biting bees and things like that. But now they're discovering that those bees, that survivor line of bee weaver stock, is surviving with the presence of Varroa. So in other words, they're resistant now. So in other words, they can handle they'll accept the viral load from those Varroa, and the parasites coexist. And this is a little bit about what Dr. Leo also talks about. It's not about killing Varroa. It's about getting genetics of bees that can manage the Varroa. Now, as a commercial beekeeper, is this your stock? Likely no, because surviving bees are not commercially viable bees necessarily if you need a big nectar flow. So or a big honey product, or pollination services, because you need large hives with a big population that can handle almond pollination, which is coming up right here, second week in February.
Is the problem not, though, it's a one-off? So let's say we do get a queen that happens to have these genetics.
Well, and that's just it, because the queen is also going to produce drones. The drones are going to fly out. And this is where, if you're generating new queens and you're not artificially inseminating, which really that to me is not the sustainable part of it, you have to flood a region, flood a geo area with these genetics exclusively. Otherwise, they have no survivability, which means on a practical level, most backyard beekeepers simply can't do it.
It's a backyard beekeeper can order a queen, and they can have one or four colonies, and they could every year, instead of making a split, could, rather than having that virgin queen go and then water down whatever genetics they think they're seeing that they're expressing, could then, that is not sustainable.
It isn't on that level. It's not
even in a backyard. If we're I'm torn between it, obviously, because we lost so many thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars trying to go down this line. And yeah, we would see certain behaviors for one generation, but daughter queens, it wasn't even, it was back to something completely different.
Right.
To where it's almost as though if we're trying to we have ideals and we have reality, and try to bridge those to something in the middle. I think that's where most of us currently are, where we can appreciate anyone who's on a farm and anything has given birth. You can see there are traits that are passed, and there's a whole new set of traits that you don't know where they come from because there's so many gens down the line. It's the message is challenging because so many backyard beekeepers, including myself at the time, completely buy into the message and completely lose bee yards year after year after year until we start trying to do something. What I can't quite fully understand is how a locally adapted bee can actually be adapted to anything and then prove out year after year.
Well, it's because you have feral colonies and you have people that are breeding bees here. And there are people that make very vague, very broad statements about bees. Light colored bees, southern bees. Dark colored bees, like the Russians and things like that, northern bees. And so when you want known genetics, which by the way, is going to be very difficult to get going forward, because I think also what's happening is we're hybridizing a lot of these lines so that they're not behaving anymore in a predictable way. So this is why when I tell people through my channel who want to get into their own breeding and they've got 5 beehives and things like that, I don't want to say it's a total waste of time, but you're not going to arrive at what you need because you need hundreds of hives to do it. You need geo-isolation to do it. And that's why if you're going to support bee genetics, Then when you do buy a queen, when you've lost one, you get them from known genetic stock. And that's why when I buy one in, for example, I buy it from Bee Weaver and they fly it in. But I mean, that bee can be impacted fertility wise in shipment. She can be overheated. She can be mismanaged and still lay when she gets here, just not do it in a prolific way. So our local stock that I recycle year after year right here is still when the drones fly out, when my virgin queens, if I do a walk away split, I have zero control over who she goes and meets. Right. That's why when I tell people in my area, if you are going to reproduce your colonies and you're going to make new queens, you want to do it as early in the spring as you can, as soon as the drones are loaded in and you start seeing lots of drones flying around. Because people have not received packages yet, and if they did, they're not at the level where they would be producing drones, so they're not going to conflict with your genetic stock. So as a minimum base, we know that those new queens are going to go out and they're going to mate with up to 20 different stock drones at a drone congregation area somewhere around here, but they will have come from colonies, feral or managed, that survived a winter. So, and that's very basic, and you're not going to know all those traits until they're reproducing in your colony and you see what they're doing. And I haven't had great luck, by the way, buying in shipped in packages from California, let's say. Those ended up being my least Varroa resistant bees, great honey producers, but did not live up to what they were described to be, right? So if we take out the transit stresses and things like that, and you do buy local bees, then you have a huge advantage that they arrived without the stresses of shipping, that they are a winter survived group of bees, right? And I don't have a lot of faith in the ability to, it's like if you bought a collie and it's a purebred collie and you find somebody else who's got a purebred collie, you get purebred offspring. Honeybees are far more complex genetically than that. And that's why, if you recall, I only did it for 10 years. And then a lot of people felt that it was very disappointing that I changed my mind and decided to treat bees that had high mite counts with oxalic acid vaporization. And but the thing is, the first year that I did that treatment, I got all of my colonies through the winter. So what am I doing? I mean, so now I do minimal treatment, verifying mite loads. And that's the other thing I find out too, is there's prophylactic treatment going on out there. And you get a whole laundry list. And this is, again, where backyard beekeepers often, if they know something will kill a mite, then more of it must work. Right. So I'm going to hit them with oxalic acid vaporization, and I'm going to use Formic Pro, right, and I'm going to use everything that I can find, and I'm going to throw it all at it. Well, what were your mite loads before you did that? Well, I don't know. And this happens in my own bee club, by the way, which is a large bee club. I start every discussion there. How many of you know your mite loads and count your mites? Less than half the beekeepers raised their hand. How many of you treat for mites? A lot of them don't, because again, they think, well, I'm just going to deal with whatever survives. But then you're not understanding really, number one, the ramifications of having a colony that dies out due to Varroa loading, because a lot of people call those mite bombs, they're mite farms. So because they're going to get robbed and then they're going to transfer all of that. And also there's a lot of eye openers out there too. When you have beekeepers that are nearby you, the number of bees drifting, your foragers, even without a dead out, your foragers drift to other colonies all the time. And those that have done those studies have found them to be as high as 30% of the workforce of this colony, not from that colony. Mm. So we have all this spread going on, this contact spread. So those that decide without verifying their loads not to treat, because I tell people you can be treatment free, but if you have a mite load and those bees aren't handling it, then you euthanize that colony. Treat it or euthanize it. Otherwise, even the bees in your own apiary that are doing well right now won't be once these Varroa farm colonies really kick in during their high reproductive season. So through drift alone, they're going to be sharing the mites and everything else. And that's, Bob Binney spoke about this at the conference. They had an outyard that was going to be used for a university study. And at the beginning of the year, they could find no mites. So, right. And then what they found out was there's another nearby, someone had passed away. No one was monitoring these colonies. And then they ended up getting drift from those, or they robbed out those colonies, whatever they did. But they took a mite-free apiary and overloaded it. And this is why backyard beekeepers have a responsibility to other backyard beekeepers to either monitor and euthanize if they need to, or monitor and treat as they need to, and then verify the efficacy of the treatment by a post-treatment count of varroa destructor mites. Right. If they're not doing that, we're just flying blind and you don't even know if your treatment worked.
Creating a baseline before you decide to do anything, trying to put a plan together for a prescribed treatment or set of treatments, and then following up after with the same way to collect the data to say this was either effective or it wasn't, and now what? Everyone is saying the same thing this year. The fall flow was terrible. Everyone was out foraging harder and further than they ever have. There was a lot of colonies that were collapsing that were on the fringe of that anyways. There was a lot of robbing going on. And all of a sudden, mites went through the roof. Now for us, we talked about it before, but the same thing happened. In June and July, we were absolutely squeaky clean. And if it wasn't for the fact that someone asked us to take a mite wash video, I probably wouldn't have. And in August, they absolutely exploded, quadrupled.
The mites.
The mites did.
Yeah.
And had we not taken that video and done the alcohol wash, we would have had no idea. And even when you think you're doing the right thing, there's always this ebb and flow of information meets practicality meets reality. So currently there's information from Randy Oliver about using Dawn Ultra dish soap instead of using rubbing alcohol.
Yeah.
Well, we tried that.
Yeah.
And when we had a 2% load on rubbing alcohol, we had 8 to 12% from the same sample of bees from the same nuke box with Dawn Ultra dish soap.
Dawn Ultra is all I use now.
It's incredibly frightening.
Well, not just that. That Dawn Ultra causes mites to release without agitation. In fact, I don't even go through the shake cycle. Was it because you can pre-mix it? You can have a gallon of it sitting around. So it's way better than alcohol, by the way, because first of all, it's cheap and it's ready and you've got it in jugs.
Yep.
So when you do that, and when I see a mite release without even shaking them, and I've already got 15, 20 mites down there, I'm at treatment levels anyway. I don't need to shake it and do a count beyond that.
Let's talk about this. So much of what we think we know about anything is only what we think we know until we know something different later.
Sure.
Okay. In this situation, what I can't really get any answers on, we decided to set up a prescribed regimen of, you name the brand of treatment, based on doing better by creating a baseline to start first. So in this case, the whole progression, we don't need to go with the history of all the different things, but let's just use an alcohol wash for an example, maybe the most recent, an alcohol wash. Do an alcohol wash, and let's say our tolerance for our area or the threshold to begin treating, let's say it's 2%. Okay, so the sample rate of the bees to mites is a 2% ratio. So we're at 2%, great. Let's do this treatment of whatever that we prescribe. What I'm seeing, and I think what other folks have seen, and I think what most folks are going to catch up on, that 2% number isn't what we thought it was. And what I mean by that is when I run...
because of the count method.
Correct.
You way underrepresented the number of mites present.
That's it.
Yeah.
In reality, that number should have been maybe 0.5% and then treat. In most cases, 99% of the bees out there are probably going to be affected by those viral loads, even at 0.5%. What the Dawn Ultra dish soap told me is, oh man, if this is true, rubbing alcohol at 2% is the same as Dawn at 8%, or it's not. And we've been using that 2% threshold with rubbing alcohol is way too high of a threshold, because what a lot of us were seeing, we felt like we were doing all the right things. We were doing all the right test protocol. We had all of the toolboxes of tools to use at the right time of year, the right stages of brood, and we're still having problems. I don't wonder, as we go on with this, if we're going to start using Dawn Ultra as that 2%, or create a number that when we find this percent using this medium, here's the results that we get. But more importantly, it's not just what Greg gets in Ohio, but Fred might get a similar number in Pennsylvania, or Bob in Georgia. Start to create some kind of a baseline where we're actually sewing a common thread of something that's actually factually based. Otherwise, we're literally chasing our tail constantly. And I don't mean disrespect to folks who are of this mentality, but if we're going to wait around and try to establish bees that somehow have viral resistance or can withstand all these things or can adapt in our small picture in time as a human, you're going to have a very specific relationship with your bees. And if that fits your context, and if that fits your scale and your goals, then I think that's great. What I am saying is there's a little bit different of a picture going on with that. But there's something about those bugs in a box that transcend, I think, our understanding of them, how they fit, and how we fit together with them. But anyone who's been on a farm, fine fowl, cows, pigs, you name it, there's a certain animal husbandry that comes along when you are taking responsibility or you're including another life form or their existence. That essence of that life form is, you feel responsible for it. For me and the bees, when I first got started, I thought I was letting nature be its complete, beautiful Lion King circle of life. Where do we go with this idea that through genetics, through viral resistance, through better practices are going to create a better relationship with us and bees, when a lot of it is based on context and a lot of it is based on scale? I don't know that there's a happy or magical formula between there, but I feel like there should at least be some kind of a baseline of understanding. Maybe is that an arrogant attitude to have with it, that we should be able to, as a keystone species, try to put something in a box and understand it?
Well, I mean, the whole thing, it's multi-pronged. So it's all of the things you describe at one time, which makes, in the face of it, beekeeping can seem like a super simple thing. I get bees, I put them in a box, they fly out, they get pollen, they get nectar, they come back, I get honey. Those are bees in a box. Those are bees in my garden. That's why I got bees. And then you'll see these empty beehives a few years down the road. This is why 80% of brand new beekeepers are out of beekeeping within the first 48 months. It's all of the things that you just described at once, which is, by the way, the appeal of Apis mellifera to begin with. We don't master the bee. What we do is we get better every year in increments at our understanding and at our approach to keeping the bees, because keep in mind, they're non-native, they're livestock, they're not from here. We brought them here, as humanity brought them here. And we put them in boxes because it gives us access to the bees. And now legally, we have to have access to those bees, and we have to be able to pull their frames and look at them. That's why we can't put them in a plastic bottle, let's say, and have a bunch of wild comb inside a bottle. Here in our state, you couldn't do it because it has to be inspected. So all of these things happen at one time. So that's why your understanding has to be broad. What configuration will they be best contained in? Which bees will handle that inconvenience the most? Because that's what we're really doing. And we've put them there. They seem to do well. People talk about their happy bees. What they really mean is healthy, shiny, bright, vibrant bees. So your goal is, through all of those approaches, to get your bees and keep them at the best health standard that you possibly can for where, and this is what's hard for new beekeepers. What works in San Diego, California may not work here, and that's frustrating when people hear that. They want a one-size-fits-all bee. They want the best hive for that bee, and they want that hive and that bee to work anywhere from Canada to Florida. And so it's not that simple, and that's why it's going to be frustrating until you start to see your bee practices succeed season after season, year after year. And hopefully Tropolaelaps doesn't zip in here and give us a brand new parasite to deal with. But so it is a moving target. There's no arrival point at which you've mastered beekeeping. Now, look at that. We've got bees and we figured it out. You have to figure it out every single season if you're keeping bees.
It's almost freeing to accept the fact that there is no arrival point.
There isn't.
It's all about that the journey and what that means for you in that relationship with the bees. What I appreciate about your channel and other folks who take that approach, it's not about portraying a specific message of you name it. It's not about getting more people to believe like me or think like me or act like me or to have the same kind of bees as me. I think what you do with your channel and folks that I think maybe understand that is they are simply sharing their experience with the bee. Mm-hmm. And folks can pick up on that, and it inspires folks to dig in a little bit deeper, especially if it's that beginning beekeeper and it's the first 48 months. It can be, I mean, we all know it's extremely frustrating and challenging and heartbreaking, and the list goes on and on and on and on. But I think, I'm always interested when we sit down with folks to find out what is it about those bugs in the box that keeps us coming back. What is it about those bugs in the box that bring 1,000 people from the entire country traveling snowstorms and treachery? What is it about those bugs in the box that lead to interviews and conversations like this? Mm-hmm. It's one of those things where once you go to exactly put your finger on that thing that you think you understand, it disappears. Mm-hmm. And so the sweet spot is almost seeing that thing in the peripheral, appreciating it for what it is, still engaging in that journey without just trying to get to that thing in the peripheral. And that might be an extremely woo-woo, hillbilly way of looking at things. But that seems to be the only constant, because the more we think we understand about these bees, everything changes so quick. There are, like you mentioned when we first got talking, there are certain fundamentals that certainly prove themselves as we understand some of the biology and attributes and characteristics and behaviors and things like that. But maybe it's the idea of not being necessarily in charge or not ever mastering that relationship, the challenge of that, the beauty and maybe understanding that I think brings so many folks to the honeybee. Fred, what got you initially so interested in these bugs in a box?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I'm a photographer. I'm a cinematographer. I've always been in life sciences, and I just like to study living organisms, and that includes undersea, all over the world. And what happened was the documentaries came out about Silence of the bees that were colony collapse disorder. And of course, again, that was Hackenberg here in the state of Pennsylvania, who discovered that his bees at his wintering staging grounds had just absconded. They were empty colonies, empty hives. So I get interested, and I started looking around the countryside myself. I was looking for honeybees, and I couldn't find any. And I contacted our Department of Agriculture, and I volunteered myself as a photographer. And so I wanted to document some of the problems going on with bees in apiaries, which I didn't even know they were called apiaries then. So I harassed them and offered my services for free, which I thought, they're just going to be so happy to have me there. And the state bee inspector that covers my area, I was not allowed to ride with him. Good for him. I had to meet him at an apiary where the owner agreed to have me be there. And so it turned out to be a very good thing for me, in that I was able to photograph every potential issue that an apiary could have that was bad. Bad for the beekeeper, great for me as a photographer with macro rigs and things like that. We saw everything from bears that are torn apart hives and completely overrun high voltage
oh my gosh
electrical.
Wow.
This guy had one guy, because I'm not using names, I'm happy to tell about the circumstances, but this guy had household current direct lined to his
bear fence?
Yeah, his bear fence.
Oh my gosh.
And it was really interesting, but shows how desperate he was to hang on to his bees. But the other thing was he had a American fowl brood. So right away I got to learn about the roping and the state inspector was great at explaining stuff. And the other thing was he just laughed when I showed up and get out of my car because he'd only spoken with me on the phone. He thought I would be about 22 tops, 23. I didn't know he had an old guy that was just very enthusiastic on his hands. But what happened was, after seeing all of those issues, he was like, you should get your own bees. You might want to have a couple of colonies right on your property there, and then you could just study them right there. And then the problem was my wife had always said no. But because we had Australian emus, we had African guinea fowl, we have Tennessee fainting goats. So all the things I wanted to learn about, I had a tendency to just bring here, like we had a big fence being put up, and my wife was like, "What's that for?" I said, "Oh, for these eggs." So these eggs came, and they were Australian emus, and 51 days later, we had a bunch of happy little foot tall.
Oh my gosh.
Birds running around. So the bees actually, by that point, it's the kind of thing where if you came home and told your parents you totaled the family car, but then after they got all ecstatic about that and you really just admitted that all you did was scrape the bumper a little, see, that's what bees are. See, bees are better than having a bunch of zebras running through your backyard. So I was able to keep bees, and then of course that gave me access to the bees. The next thing I wanted to do, of course, is see what goes on inside the hive. So the next step was an observation hive. And so I converted my Australian emu building for observation for bees and set up special lighting in there, macro rigs, and then I videoed the interiors, and that got the attention of a lot of different people, including Animal Planet, who hired me through Warner Brothers, owns them, Discovery Channel, and then that is through my exposure through YouTube.
Wow.
So it was a really cool thing. One of those deals where somebody writes you and says they're a producer and they want to use your sequences, and it seemed fake, like,
Nigerian king, send me money.
Couldn't be right. Yeah. So anyway, so I did that, and that got me connected to a lot of other things. So my work has been on Irish public television. So all these interesting, very small bits of exposure, which leads me to bring a camera with me as a witness to the biology and the behaviors of bees inside the hive. And before I even enrolled at Cornell, there were graduate students there that had reached out to me and asked for audible recordings about the bees, audible communications, the piping of the queens, quacking of the queens, things like that. So I provided them with all of those resources free, just to support education. So I've always had a soft spot for advanced education, and if they're using my stuff, my only requirement was that they mention where the work came from. And ultimately, I ended up credited in Nature's Strangest Mysteries Solved. It's National Geographic, Frederick Dunn.
Can you read the print when it plays by?
So I think it goes pretty quick. And unfortunately, I wish I'd seen the show. I didn't. But a friend sent me a screenshot of the credits.
There you go.
So, and before anybody thinks it's in 2019 that came out. It was the last episode. So I think it was episode 26. And so I want people to know how big a part I played in that episode. 8 full seconds.
8 full seconds in the States, and
8 full seconds.
It's fair to say you're
Strangest Mysteries.
You're big in Europe.
That's big in Europe. Big in Australia. People in Australia watch me.
Wow.
I have a pretty good following down there, New South Wales. In fact, when they finally relaxed their travel restrictions right now, I've been invited to New South Wales to talk about bees, so I'm excited about that.
That's cool. That'll be a nice feather in your cap.
I wonder if I'm allowed to say that. Maybe that's a non-disclosure thing until I go there.
Oh.
I don't know.
Did they write a check yet?
Maybe. No.
Okay, I think you're probably okay.
Okay, then. Warner Brothers pays good, just want to tell you.
Really?
By the second.
Wow. 8 seconds at Warner Brothers.
I hate to brag. If I was a bull rider, that 8 seconds would be all I needed.
That's true. Context is key,
That's what I'm saying.
Perspective.
Yeah, I was just glad to be included. Anywhere your name shows up. So anyway, yeah, that's what I get into. And then one thing led to another. took courses, studied stuff. I became a master beekeeper so that for a lot of reasons. One was to fill in any gaps I felt I might have in bee management knowledge and stuff like that. The other thing is that's a door opener. So I can talk to other people. So the circle of kind of a fellowship of master beekeepers is really good all over the world. And then, of course, having access to higher level academics and their research. And
it looks cool on a business card, though, too.
I've never written it anywhere, but if you say so.
Really? Oh, wow. Well, if you need more humble brags, then I guess you just keep that one for a little bit later. So it was either come home and start a shrew breeding farm or get honeybees. And then shrews, so we went honeybees.
You can do it all at once. You don't have to be a one-trick pony.
Really?
Oh, you can have shrews. I've got deer mice, house mice. That's the other thing. As you come across things, document them.
Documenting house mice. That could be a whole new YouTube channel.
Yeah, they're all gray, above and below.
Really?
Where the deer mouse is the color of a deer on its back, and it's, of course, creamy white on the underside. Unless they're juveniles, and they're gray on the back and creamy white on the underside.
Now what about moles? Voles
and moles are totally different.
Okay.
But they're one color all over. And the shrew looks like it's made out of felt. The hair on that shrew is so dense. Do you want to have your mind blown right now?
I do.
Okay. Have you ever heard of a water shrew?
I have not.
Okay. Now, most people don't realize this. The water shrew leaves the surface of the water and gets minnows and things like that. Now, a water shrew has to locate its prey in very low visibility. First of all, their eyes are basically worthless underwater. So how do they know when they've grabbed onto a prey item that's edible? How do they smell it underwater? Let me explain. It gets a hold of that, and this happens in a matter of seconds. The water shrew gets a hold of a minnow only because it made the mistake of moving. A static minnow that just sits there, the shrew goes all around. Its little whiskers are out, sensing movement. If there's movement, it latches on immediately, and it pushes out a little air bubble from its nose. The air bubble contacts whatever it's grabbed onto, and it inhales the air bubble back, and it smells the animal.
You've got to be kidding me.
Mind blown.
Wow.
That's nature. So it actually puts out a little snot bubble. Ooh, can I say that? That's probably rude. It puts out an air bubble against what it's holding on to, sniffs it back in, food, takes it up and eats it. You're deeper now because we had this conversation.
I don't even know where to go from there because that's to the point to where some of the world's greatest mysteries have been solved right in front of my face. Yeah, and now I know how to survive.
No, I did not discover that behavior, but I'm just happy to know the facts.
Wow.
Somebody at some point through observation alone figured out that was going on. That's science. Through direct observation. That's what happens with honeybees. There are still things to be observed with honeybees that are not well documented. I mean, we know about the Nasonov gland because there's an anatomist named Nasonov who was looking at bees and saw what they were doing and had to figure out what that particular function was. And it's direct observation and then following up with some hopefully fundamental knowledge about the biology of the bees. But we are still learning things about the honeybee.
The oldest texts that include honeybees would be maybe something, or at least ones that we can decipher, maybe old Sumerian text or...
Well, Dr. Peck kind of hit on that at the conference. He spoke about, Aristotle, I believe, spoke or wrote about honeybees and things like that. I don't know what the oldest text is.
At some point, some dummy came to some smart realization or an understanding or saw what bees are doing and decided, I'm going to stick my hand in there and get the sweet stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is what do you call those like those initial moments of things of course it's a genesis, but
that epiphany.
That initial point in time where either knowledge was given to him and he acted, or he just said, what happens if, or I'm going to have my brother do this instead, or that seems to be so cool to be.
And the idea that you could use smoke to calm them and not be stung to death while you did it. Yeah.
How long did it take them to figure that out?
I think a lot of that, now I'm not a scientist who studies the history of mankind or anything, or carbon-based bipeds and which ones survived.
Those were a lot of big words. Are you sure you don't?
But I think they did it through observation, and I think they noticed that other animals were probably accessing food resources, and I think that they ended up copycatting that. There's speculation about how we even figured out how to do maple syrup and things like that, and then they saw animals wounding trees and things, and the sap would come out, but it would dry back, and then they would see animals going back to those same little injured points, and then realize that the sugars were being concentrated. I mean, today we do it much different, but I think humans were very good at exploiting the resources of other animals.
That's a very sensitive subject, exploiting resources
of other animals. That's what we do to bees. Animals. That's what we're doing right now.
That's exactly what we're doing. That's what mankind has done as we evolve to the consumer civilization that we're in. It goes way, 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 way back, and that's how we got here. But that's a point of consideration. We just talked about the epiphany of things, getting to a point to where there's a tipping point, and all of a sudden we are so much further down the road with an understanding. It's through observation.
Mm-hmm.
And the art of observation, if you will, if there's a term for that, seems to be unfortunately completely lost in a lot of aspects in life. But everyone is so eager to just grab a book or watch a video, or those are all great things. But you know what a lot of people don't do is just to set a chair out in front of their hive and watch. There's at some point in time, as we've evolved as humans, there's been some kind of disconnect where that art of observation or natural observation seems to be, and I could be completely wrong because that happens all the time. Ask my wife. Where that's huge.
Jake,
the cameraman, he's like, he's fist pumping back here, thinking that is never right. The art of observation is something that I don't know how we can encourage folks to just do that. But if anyone is listening, which is more than just my mom, hopefully, take a chair and put it out next to your beehive and just sit and quiet yourself and get still and just focus on the bees, the smell, the sound, what they're doing. There's something, I hate to use the word magical that happens, but there is such a profound experience and relationship for a lot of folks that just sitting here looking at this cup, this mug that I'm drinking, the color, the vibrancy, everything. There's something about those bugs in a box that you don't have to be a walking encyclopedia like Fred to pick up on that.
And they're fuzzy. So
they're fuzzy.
You're attracted to fuzzy bees.
Fuzzy bees.
And their hairs have split ends.
I did not know that.
That's why when they fly through the air, their split end, their frizzy hair that humans don't like, develops a static charge as they fly. And then when they land on the flower, the anther of the flower releases its pollen to that static charge, and then they sweep it back. But the observation thing, not everyone's curious. Not everyone is curious at that level. And that's why when I ask people, why are you getting into beekeeping? Because they heard there's money in it. Then you're not my people. I want the people that want to understand the bee, that are fascinated by it. And here's an interesting person that almost everyone's heard of, Jane Goodall.
Yep.
Do you know who that is?
Oh, sure do.
Okay. A lot of people don't know the history of Jane Goodall. What she is, she's an observer. She was not that educated, by the way. When she was a kid at home, she was always out with the animals. They had some animals, small backyard farm. A chicken was hiding its egg somewhere. And Jane went and dug herself into a pile of hay and waited there for hours while her parents searched for her. She wanted to see where the chicken was hiding its eggs, and she satisfied that. Later, she was actually hired because of her ability to observe and deduce behaviors and unique things about animals that other people were not doing. It wasn't because she was a zoologist or anything like that, because she wasn't. What she was a keen observer. Later, her academic merit came along, but she was picked because she had this locked in need to understand what she was looking at and what was going on.
Cool.
And that, to me, is the kind of person I want to see in beekeeping, who just has to know what is going on, even when they see a bee on a flower. And kids are fantastic to talk to because if they're interested, that's the one I want to talk to. If I have to make them interested, that's a lot of work. But if you get a hold of a drone, and this has happened before, somebody called because there were a bunch of bees in a bee tree, and this was in a very affluent part of the neighboring city here. And I showed up there, and this little kid came out wanting to know what I was doing, and there were drones all over the ground. And I said, "These are bees. Look at that tree up there. Hold your hand out." And she was like, "What?" I said, "Hold your hands out. Do you trust me?" She doesn't know who I am. I gathered up a bunch of drones and put them in her hand. I said, "Close your hand around them. They can't sting you and they can't bite." She was so excited that she ran around with a handful of drones. And when her concerned parents came out in their yard, she ran right at them and opened her hand, and bees flew out, and her mother was horrified.
That's awesome.
But I was hoping that I created a memory for that child that might inspire her. Obviously open, because other kids would scream and run away. I mean, not every child would even be interested, let alone hold their hand open and trust a stranger to put a bee in your hand and trust that if he says it won't sting you, it won't. So those are the people that I'm hoping watch my videos.
That's awesome.
Because they have to see, they have to know. They're fascinated. And one thing leads to another. And that's why only the fool knows everything. And that's why we are staying open. You know, if I ever said, "Oh, I know everything about bees," certainly not. I know more now than I knew a week ago after all these years. And I know I'm going to know more a year from now. We are always stumbling across new information. Shrews that blow bubbles out of their nose so they can sniff a fish underwater. I mean, the nature and life sciences in general are endless, but the honeybee provides us fertile learning resources for the rest of our lives.
Fred, I want to thank you for having us in here, sitting down with a cup of coffee, just talking about bees.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming out, Greg. I really enjoyed hanging out with you. I'm glad I met you, and hope we stay in touch.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for coming out.
Man, that has to be one of my all-time favorite conversations. Be sure to check out Fred's YouTube channel at Fred Dunn. Check out his podcast, The Way to Bee, and also his website, fredsfinefowl.com. On that website, he's got some really cool stuff, including some of the coolest beekeeping coffee mugs that you ever did see. I hope this conversation gives you something to think about, something to chew on, something to mull over, something to flesh out. To treat or not to treat? Is that even a question? Hey, let's continue this conversation over on our Facebook page at Nature's Image Farm. We'll see you over there. And as always, we want to remind you to be the lighthouse and be the change you want to see in this world. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.
Way to be, Fred.
Way to be, Greg.